Hi, Sonya. How are you?
I'm good. How are you?
Good, good, good. So I'm gonna actually just get us started right away. I know we're in our sort of natural habitat of Zooming together. I feel like I see more,
Yeah.
even more of you on Zoom these days, right? Um, so I know we wanted to start by doing some introductions. You are, if you are tuning in, I guess for lack of a better word, you are watching myself and Sonya in conversation. My name is Kijua Sanders-McMurtry. I am the Vice President for Equity and Inclusion and Chief Diversity Officer at Mount Holyoke College, and I use she, her, hers pronouns. I'm going to let my colleague introduce herself.
Hi, my name is Sonya Stevens, and I'm the president of Mount Holyoke College, and my pronouns are also she, her, hers.
So it's wonderful to be with you, Sonya, particularly because we are actually celebrating our 4th annual Boom, which is our building on our momentum day devoted to diversity, our community day, diversity to diversity, equity, inclusion, learning. And we see it as a rich opportunity to gather community members and do all the sorts of workshops and sessions and dialogues. And often it is led and shepherded by students, faculty, staff, and some alum who are guest speakers. And we also bring in external speakers. And so while this year is distinctly and uniquely different from any year prior to now, I know that Boom was sort of my introduction to the campus community, and it was one of the things that made me so excited to work with you as the president of Mount Holyoke, because Boom was initiated and started under your tenure as interim president, and then you have kept it going as part of your presidency and your leadership of the college, and I'm excited to be here for that reason. I also just wanted to say that I think, in particular, what we thought we'd do is we've been wanting to have this conversation, I think, forever. This like feels like we're sort of like in our own little conversations we have all the time over snacks or whenever we get a chance to sit and have meetings with each other one-on-one, and we sort of get in these deep dialogues around challenging racism and challenging xenophobia, and so I don't think it's anything we'd ever want to stop, right? In a
Right.
global pandemic. In fact, the reason why we titled this Now More Than Ever is because we feel like diversity, equity, inclusion needs to still be at the center and the forefront of these kinds of conversations. So this series will cover meta questions or meta kind of issues that we feel like we should unpack together. And I know this one is a big one that comes up for us all the time, is thinking about how we describe ourselves. That there have been so many ways for us to think about who we are as a women's college in 2020. And so people have asked us a lot about how we describe ourselves, particularly related to our policy around admitting people across the gender diversity spectrum. So I'd love to hear from you, like how you would talk about how we describe ourselves and what conclusions we've come to.
Yeah. So you and I have talked a lot about this, right? And we've talked with the Board of Trustees, and we've talked with our colleagues, and I think we've both spent a lot of time talking with students about it over time.
Yeah.
And more than anything else, I think what we want to do is to make sure that we're living up to the promise of our policies, and to think about ourselves as a very particular space. And being a women's college enables us to do that. I know often, there's this notion that co-ed schools can be more inclusive.
Mm-hmm.
But for me, very clearly there's this sort of implicit nature of a binary even in co-ed.
Yeah, I agree.
But there doesn't need to be, but there is, right? And so, and just as we think about women's college as playing into that binary, I think that what we're trying to do is to trouble that and to say women's colleges, and Mount Holyoke in particular, is a space where we can be the gender affirming and gender diverse institution we really want to be. And so I think that that's the language that I would prefer to use, that Mount Holyoke is a women's college that is gender diverse.
I would 100% agree with you. I think we had like, I remember like a long, retreat with all of our senior leaders, and there were so many terms thrown out, and everything from what we hear all the time, which is that we're historically women's college, or that we are a women's college that is gender affirming. And I think one of the reasons why we loved women's college that is gender diverse, from what I recall, is that first of all, it recognized that Mount Holyoke has probably always been a place that has had individuals who identified across the gender diversity spectrum, who maybe when it wasn't as safe in society to be more visible, people were able to claim the space of being gender nonconforming in some way within the institution. But I would venture to say that, we don't know how long we've had trans men or trans women or people who identify as non-binary or gender nonconforming in the space. And that is something that we feel like we wanted to be very bold about saying that we know we are a gender diverse institution. And one of the reasons why we steered away from historically women's college is because there's so much loaded in that, right? There's this notion of being like culturally appropriative, and that there are historically Black colleges, and there's unique and distinct reasons why those institutions call themselves historically Black colleges. And so we didn't want to be appropriative of that. I know for myself, as a person who identifies as a Black woman, that, and having attended and worked at a historically Black college and university, I think it was really important to not go down that path. And I think the other, although, I know people continue to call us a historically women's college, it also sort of gives this idea that like maybe we were once a women's college and now we're not really a women's college. And that sort of is troubling in some ways, because it sort of goes against like sort of what women's colleges were, like what you just said, like we've sort of always been places that transgress gender norms. And so we really feel, I think, much more comfortable with being a women's college that is gender diverse and using that language. And I feel like that language you'll start to see all over much of the literature we put out. So I'm really excited that we've come to this place. And I think I'd love to hear you maybe talk a little bit about what you think has, so we, in 2014, it became the place that, in a very public way, I think there were many colleges, I've worked with women's colleges that were sort of trying to figure out better ways to be more inclusive and more thoughtful around particularly transgender students on our campuses. But it often missed the mark. I think we also have been learning a lot about the journey we're on. Are there thoughts that you have about that sort of evolution and where we are now in terms of the journey?
Yeah, well, I think two things. First of all, I think, to go back to the earlier part of the conversation, I do think that talking about Mount Holyoke as a women's college that's gender diverse also enables us to link back to our founding principle, right? I think that that when you think about Mount Holyoke as an institution that was founded against the very notion of gender discrimination in education, this is a moment for us to reaffirm our commitment to be anti-discriminatory in terms of gender and in every other way too. So I think let me start by saying that, and then say that yes, when we announced the new admission policy in 2014, I think there was a very much a destination in mind, right? That we wanted to be this place that was inclusive, gender affirming, and yet probably we didn't know how much work we had to do to make that aspiration a reality for our students. And so I think that, like much of the work that we do, and that you particularly now are engaged in with us, it's a journey, and it's been a long journey so far, but I feel as if we've made a lot of progress over the last few years, and particularly since we now have somebody who is leading the charge on this and able to support the changes that we need to see systemically. So maybe you could say a little bit about how you see that and what you bring to this work that we didn't have before in the same way, I don't think.
Yeah, I think what's interesting, what I loved about my early days here is you were very honest with me about, this journey that we were on. And I think you were very honest about, and I always have been like very honest with me about so many things that related to DEI, which I've always so much appreciated. And I think what I learned very quickly was that this, even in the interview process, this was a place that wanted to fulfill the promise we made to students in 2014, but hadn't quite figured out all the ways, like what needs to happen in terms of the infrastructure, what policy changes need to happen, what sort of language do we need to use on the webpage, what sorts of trainings that all the faculty, staff, and students need to have ongoing, because it felt like there was even a deficit, like sort of a gap between the knowledge base, right? Which could be generational, it could be because of different ways we've learned from our different life experiences from all over the world in this incredibly diverse and inclusive community. And so I feel like that was really evident to me before I came here. And I was actually inspired and excited to come here for that reason, because I had come from a women's college that was gender diverse, and also been working on trans inclusion work. And I've always seen it as, and what I knew coming here, honestly, was that there probably would always have been students who were sort of trailblazing and pushing and, and
always
requesting and often, sort of demanding that they be heard and be seen. And so I think you all had made it clear to me that wanting to figure out ways to create safety for students so that they could continue to push us to do better, but do so in ways that weren't so burdensome to them. I know that was incredibly important to you, and I always felt so honored by that work. And what I have learned in doing this work is that it's not, I'm a cisgender person, meaning that how I was assigned at birth in terms of my gender is how I also identify. And while I might have other marginalized identities that allow me to have some sensitivity to the ways that people who are on the margins might experience their life, it doesn't mean that I actually could understand what it means to be a trans student at Mount Holyoke. And I'm highly sensitive to that and wanting to always amplify the voices of trans and gender nonconforming members of our community, whether it's students, faculty, staff, or alum, but doing so in a way that doesn't also put that work on them, right?
Absolutely.
Is really important. So I think that's what I would have to say is, like, now we get the opportunity to do this work together and continue to, be open to kind of the feedback we get around work that we need to continue to do. So I definitely don't see it as a destination. I see it as a journey. And I think we just have to keep at it. And that's why we now have the new trans and gender nonconforming affirming practices working group. We actually just started looking at changing our name because people were saying, well, if we just call ourselves a trans affirming practices working group, is that inclusive enough of gender nonconforming people? And so it's like, we're constantly like thinking about, how to make sure that we're doing work that is from a place of understanding and growth. So I'm glad we've talked about that. Did you want to
I do think, that one of the other things, I mean, the work that the students did early on, I mean, I think about the trans memo, as it was called. It really sort of laid the groundwork. And I think we were all conscious in that moment that we didn't want that burden to be on the students, right? That it's our work to do, that it's our work to do for them and with them. And so I think really trying to think about, as you say, given our positionality, how we inform ourselves so that we can come to the work with understanding and compassion and with commitment to make the things happen that need to happen for that real inclusion to occur.
Yeah, I know, like you, I always feel like I have a syllabus like with you, like
right back at you. You send me a lot of stuff too.
We're always sending each other like articles to read and tips to read and books. And so, I really thought like maybe, I know you and I have talked about like in conversation all the time, like our latest reading. So like when Dean Spade came in the fall, we both were familiar with Dean Spade, and I know for me, Dean Spade, having worked with him previously and having read his article, one of his articles that was really like a landmark moment for me was called Documenting Gender. And it's an incredible article. I would encourage anyone watching us to read this article. But you recently came to me and said, like, I have this new book on pronouns. And it was an incredible book from a linguist who was really sort of unpacking, sort of the history of pronouns. Do you want to talk a little bit about that book and what it was like to read it and why it's important to you to stay on top of readings when you're trying to do this work of understanding identity? Yeah,
it's by Dennis Barron. You said you couldn't find it earlier, so I went to get it. This is it, right?
Yeah, that's it. Yeah, what's your pronoun? Yep, that's it.
And it's there. What's your pronoun beyond he and she? Dennis Barron, he, him, his. On the front cover. So I mean, of course, it's the book that really is a history of the use of pronouns in English. Yeah. And so he looks at it from a linguistic point of view, but also from a literary point of view. And the students make fun of me because of what I said about my love of dictionaries.
Yeah.
But there's a little bit in this where he's talking about dictionaries and how that certain dictionaries weren't always the last word, so to speak. And so I love that he challenges the authority of the dictionary and the authority of language at any one period, or even the kind of the authority of grammar nitpickers that we sometimes experience when we're talking about pronouns. And what I love about his book is that he really gives us a timeline for the way in which they has been used as a singular pronoun, for example, which he says it does exist in English. It's always been used in this way. But he's also saying this isn't the last word, right? That we're all here and we know our students are shaping the future of the language by by determining how they want to be seen and referred to, right? It's a speech act.
Yeah.
But it's not just a speech act. It's really about acknowledging and respecting the identity of the person with whom you're in conversation, with whom you're engaging. And so for me, this book was all about, you know, understanding the linguistic origins of pronouns and pronoun use. But it's another way really of coming to the conversation with concern and respect.
Yeah, and I mean, you always say this to me when you're talking about the readings, like you really are really conscious of like doing that individual work for yourself, so that when we get in these collective spaces and have to have these discussions, that we are really more thoughtful about not having to ask questions of people
Yes.
Around their identity when we could be doing that work
Right.
ourselves. And so I appreciate that so much. I feel like that's so much a part of how we've always been able to work together. It's like we sort of come to this common place of understanding. And I hope that, you know, that's something we continue to do as we work together. I'm always excited to get, a book from you, you know, and I know our future conversations, we want to get more into talking about race. And
Yeah.
it's a great book you gave me like a few months ago. I think you gave it to all of the cabinet last summer around bias.
Yeah.
In particular, it was a really amazing book that looked at and documented like sort of like this long understanding of like bias and police brutality and all sorts of things. So I think our next conversation about this is going to be really exciting. So I think another thing that, you know, this sort of leads me to think about that we wanted to talk about and unpack is, what, right now, right, speaking of racism, we're seeing, sadly, I think, and shockingly, and maybe not so shockingly, honestly, sort of this resurgence. I don't even think it's like, for some people, it might seem like something that's happened for the first time, but if we know anything about sort of the history of how Asian and Asian American people have been discriminated against in the United States, there has been this history of like the Chinese Exclusion Act of 1882 and the Japanese internment camps. And now with COVID-19, there's been this rise of, stigmatization of Asian and Asian American people. And I think people really want to know, what are we doing at Mount Holyoke to both counter that narrative and challenge, that xenophobia and anti-immigrant rhetoric? And so what are your thoughts about that? What would you want to say and share?
Yeah, I mean, I think it's been really very disturbing to see sort of very clear evidence of both social and political use of racist and xenophobic language in a situation where people are already fearful. And so playing upon people's fears and sort of encouraging division or encouraging blame is really just stoking the kind of racist and the sort of the systemic concerns that already exist, and in the middle of a pandemic where there's already significant loss, grieving in communities of color broadly. So I think that anti-Chinese, anti-Chinese American, anti-Asian sentiment has sort of returned in a way that perhaps we haven't seen for a long time, although it's, as you say, it's systemic and historical as well. Yeah. And then I think that the fact that we're seeing larger numbers of people of color succumbing to the illness and dying, and so the loss in those communities really is demonstrative of the same kind of systemic inequity.
Yeah.
Whether it's access to healthcare, whether it's economic, socioeconomic, whether it's housing. And I just think that this is a moment for us to support each other and to support those communities more than ever.
Yeah, I agree. I think, I know you and I, and our colleagues who are often having to make some tough decisions around policies, around, around all sorts of things that have come up in this time of the global pandemic. It's been really hard, I think, sometimes to figure out, like, are we in the right position? Are we doing the right thing? And constantly asking ourselves, like, is this a just and right thing to do? I mean, I've been on so many conversations where I've like seen, like, that look on your face of like, are we doing the right thing? And I think what you just said about, in particular, how African-American people and Latinx people we're seeing die at higher, rates. I mean, just a lot of the data is showing us this. And and wondering, for me, I know personally, I'm always like, am I in the right place at the right time? And I feel like I am. I feel like, part of doing Boom, part of having this dialogue with you is knowing that sometimes we have to be in a place where we can actually influence, right? Those who might one day shape policy, one day, transform how we do this work. And we know that Mount Holyoke has produced leaders for, I mean, for, I don't know, for over 100 years, right? Like,
nearly 200. Yeah,
almost 200 years, right? Thank you. So I think it's really, really important to recognize that, this is an important time where we can actually speak to these issues and think more critically about how we address these issues. And so I'm glad to hear you say that, at Mount Holyoke, we absolutely believe that it's important to say that we don't believe that these stereotypes around Asian American people should ever be accepted, and we reject them holistically, and that we will continue to hold many of our community members who might be experiencing loss right now in our thoughts going forward. If you think a little bit about and I think we'll wrap up maybe with this last one, and then think, I know we'll be in our next video talking more about the, book bias, and talking more about kind of our own growth and journeys around some of those other more difficult topics. But if you think about why it's so important to have a day like Boom, or a day that focuses on learning about diversity, what for you is important, both personally and professionally, about this day and about learning about diversity, equity, inclusion? What would you say as a kind of summative statement to close it out?
So when we were thinking about Boom, the idea was that it was a learning conference, right? That we were learning together. And that this was an opportunity for people to join the conversation wherever they were, however much they'd read, or however much work they'd done on their own, however little they knew, and to be in conversation with others like and unlike them. And to sort of grow personally in terms of empathy and understanding around the issues of race and gender, particularly in our context. And so, and probably national identity too, given that we're such a global community, and we've had an emphasis on that last year. So for me, I think that as an educational institution, what we're trying to do is to support our students' intellectual aspirations, their professional aspirations as well, clearly. But this is also about personal growth, right? Who we become when we're in college and when we're engaged in learning, we're always growing. And so the idea that we could have this moment of learning together, learning from each other, having our students, sort of turning the tables a bit, and having the students who want to lead the conversation for the faculty, the staff, and for their peers. So that notion of really learning from each other in ways that are structured and unstructured, and that really move the conversation forward.
Yeah. Well, I want to thank you so much for participating in this conversation with me, Sonya. I know it honestly does feel like someone's videotaping one of our regular.
I know, it's true.
Snacks, because you're always giving me snacks, which is amazing.
Because you never eat lunch. I have to, and then you always come after lunch. I'm worried that you haven't eaten.
I know. I always appreciate it, but I want to say, I think for me, I think it really has been an honor to do this work in this community, and I hope you all can see my Boom.
Yeah, that's excellent.
I'm particularly excited about Boom this year because we are, Yom HaShoah is a time of reflection for many people around Holocaust Remembrance Day, and we are definitely featuring the stories of Holocaust survivors and being really conscious and thoughtful about the reflection piece related to that. It's also Ramadan has just begun, and so we are thinking a lot about, in particular, challenging Islamophobia with some of the speakers we have. And we have sessions on Trans 101 and all the things we've talked about. So I think it's going to be a great day. It will be virtual, and it's going to be an opportunity for people to engage with each other virtually until we can all be in the same place, our Mo home together again one day. So
that will be so good. It will be I will be so happy to see everyone back here.
I know. I can't wait to see you in person. I'm going to give you a big high five for
That's excellent. I wonder what you're doing for snacks these days.
Sonya, you don't want to know. So thank you so much. You have a great.
All right, so great talking to you.
Great talking to you.
Always wonderful to talk to you, Kijua.
Okay, take care. Bye.
And you too.